So, as we're talking about making changes in how we interact with people in our business and in generating funds and creating our networks, there's kind of a parallel with things in our lives. And so I thought it would be a good idea to just briefly talk about habits. Habits are very related to everything that we're talking about in that they happen unconsciously. They're not happening based on conscious directed thought. Perhaps at one point they were when they were first becoming habits, but then over time it becomes muscle memory. So habits are extremely important to our lives. They have a huge degree of impact on what happens with us, both personally and professionally. And so from that angle, I have to say I just recently read this book. It's wonderful. It's by, he's a journalist with the New York Times, a man named Charles Duhigg, but this book has been, I think, really important for a lot of people, where he is able to articulate how important habits are, how hard it is to build them and change them, but that it's doable. And so there were three main ideas that he describes in the book that I thought were worth just kind of going through with you guys so that we can think about where this might apply in our lives. So the first idea of understanding habits is that they exist in three parts. There is a cue, which is the thing that tells you like, it's time to do something. There's the routine, which is the actual behavior that you take. And then there is the reward, which is what you feel after having taken the behavior. So let's go with smoking. The cue would be the urge for a cigarette. You feel like you need to go out and have one. The routine is taking out a cigarette and lighting it. The reward, maybe it's the deep breath, maybe it is the feeling of nicotine in the brain, but people aren't thinking about, should I have a cigarette now? What's this going to do to my long-term health? They just feel the cue, and they unthinkingly engage in the routine and have the reward. Same is true for eating. Perhaps the cue is your stomach rumbles, the routine is you grab some unhealthy food, and the reward is you're no longer uncomfortable. So you can look at all of your habits and realize that they all break down in this way. And this is really meaningful because if you want to change a habit or build new habits, there's a couple of important things to know. And the first is what he calls the golden rule of habits. And the idea here is that there's no such thing as killing an old habit or creating a new habit. It's just changing habits. You can't just stop something. Nor can you just start something, but you can change. And where he says to change is not in the cue and not in the reward, but in the routine. So going back to the smoking example, if you want to change your habit to not become a smoker, when you feel the urge for that cigarette, what's going to be the new routine? Perhaps the new routine is instead you're going to sit on your hands and take 10 deep breaths. Then the reward, theoretically, should be closer to what you experience when you light a cigarette, which is that you're breathing deeply, you're calming down, you're unplugging for a moment. Now, by the way, I have no idea if sitting on your hands and taking deep breaths actually works for quitting smoking. It was just a really cool example that came to me last night. So maybe I'll try and find some smokers and see if that can help. But beyond the golden rule of habits, there's this other concept that I think is really important. It's called Keystone habits. And these are things in our lives where one habit affects many others. So for example, if you can embrace the habit of exercising every day, suddenly the habit of going to sleep at a reasonable hour becomes much easier. Eating well becomes much easier. And so as you look through your life, whether personally or in business, you can start to think about, well, what habits would then set up other habits to succeed? And so these are some things that we can do that will put us in a position to try to have a best chance of making some real changes in how we're behaving ourselves. And so finally, I thought it would be fun to just share with you, these are, we'll call them willpower hacks, because when you're changing a habit and the cue comes up, it will take some willpower to change your routine. You're going to have to want to do that. And so within behavioral economics, we take what we understand about how we ourselves operate and start to make some rules, some actions or techniques that will support some of that willpower. So the first one is called hot and cold planning. We as human beings, whenever we're feeling extremely anything, angry, sad, frustrated, that's called happy, confident, anything that's extreme, that's considered a hot state. A cold state is when we're a little bit more detached, we're not very emotional, we're probably feeling a little bit more analytical. And it's important that we understand that because we should only make plans in a cold state. So let me just give you the most obvious example of that. What happens when you go to the supermarket and you're starving? You buy so much of the worst stuff. Your hunger is putting you in a hot state. But if you go to the grocery store in a cold state when you're feeling fine, you're likely to make much better decisions, buy healthier food, not as much of it. So that would be a terrific example there. Commitment contracts. So when we make commitments to other people, we tend to value them more than commitments that we make to ourselves. It shouldn't be that way, but we as human beings, even goes back to evolution. The idea of sort of like the herd mentality, that if back when we were traveling in packs of, well, I don't want to even get into the evolution debate, but the idea is that if you were excommunicated from the herd, your life was very much in danger. And so we are hardwired to sort of be in the group, which explains why social pressure has such an impact on us. So with commitment contracts, we can try to curb our behavior by making commitments to other people. So one example of that would be if you have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning, start scheduling meetings for 9 a.m. and you will get out of bed in the morning because not going to the gym and working out doesn't really have ramifications for you. Consistently showing up to early meetings with your boss, that has some ramifications for you and you will find the motivation. Temptation bundling. This is much simpler than it sounds. It just means reward yourself when you're good. So if there is something that you really like and something that you really don't like but you have to do, put them together. And so one very common example of this is that for every hour I put in the gym, I get 2 hours of Netflix. So that is a way to build motivation and make sure that you follow through more so than if there was no consequence to whether or not you go to the gym. Socializing intentions. This is kind of like a commitment contract, but instead of making a commitment in this case, it's merely letting other people know what it is that you're trying to do. That tends to boost our motivation to follow through, knowing that other people are witness to it and could in fact judge it. And so I'm trying to make this as relevant as possible. Yes, Facebook counts. So if you make an announcement on Facebook, for all intents and purposes here, that counts. You have let people know what it is that you're trying to do, and you now have a new level of motivation to stay committed to it. And then this last one is one of my favorites. It's almost hard for me to believe that it's true, but it is. When you write down a goal, you are 50% more likely to achieve it, 50. However, typing does not equal writing. This doesn't count. You actually need to grab a pen and a piece of paper and write it down. For whatever reason, typing out our goals does not lead to an increase in the likelihood that we achieve them, but writing it down with a pen has a huge impact. I can't tell you why it is, I just know that it works. So this is certainly something that I think everyone can do because clarifying what you want to intend and putting it out there beyond just your own mind somehow seems to make it more real for us.